This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 6. The Buccaneers. Once more the blacks formed a circle around our adventurer, who coolly drew his tube and said to the chief, "Tell your people I'm going to walk away through those trees, and if anyone dares to interfere with me, I'll paralyze him." The chief understood enough English to catch his meaning, and repeated the message to his men. Having seen the terrible effect of the electric tube, they wisely fell back and allowed the boy to pass. He marched through their lines with a fine air of dignity, although he was fearful lest some of the blacks should stick a spear into him or bump his head with a war club. But they were awed by the wonders they had seen, and were still inclined to believe him a god, so he was not molested. When he found himself outside the village, he made for the high plateau in the center of the island, where he could be safe from the cannibals while he collected his thoughts. But when he reached the place, he found the sides so steep he could not climb them, so he adjusted the indicator to the word "up," and found it had still enough power to support his body while he clambered up the rocks to the level, grass-covered space at the top. Then, reclining upon his back, he gave himself up to thoughts of how he might escape from his unpleasant predicament. "Here I am on a cannibal island, hundreds of miles from civilization, with no way to get back," he reflected. "The family will look for me every day and finally decide I've broken my neck. The Demon will call upon me when the week is up and won't find me at home, so I'll miss the next 3 gifts. I don't mind that so much, for they might bring me into worse scrapes than this. But how am I to get away from this beastly island? I'll be eaten after all if I don't look out." These and similar thoughts occupied him for some time, yet in spite of much planning and thinking he could find no practical means of escape. At the end of an hour he looked over the edge of the plateau and found it surrounded by a ring of the black cannibals, who had calmly seated themselves to watch his movements. "Perhaps they intend to starve me into surrender," he thought, "but they won't succeed so long as my tablets hold out. And if, in time, they should starve me, I'll be too thin and tough to make good eating, so I'll get the best of them anyhow." Then he lay down again and began to examine his electrical traveling machine. He did not dare take it apart, fearing he might not be able to get it together again, for he knew nothing at all about its construction. But he discovered 2 little dents on the edge, one on each side, which had evidently been caused by the pressure of the rope. If I could get those dents out, he thought, the machine might work. He first tried to pry out the edges with his pocket knife, but the attempt resulted in failure. Then, as the sides seemed a little bulged outward by the dents, he placed the machine between 2 flat stones and pressed them together until the little instrument was nearly round again. The dents remained, to be sure, but he hoped he had removed the pressure upon the works. There was just one way to discover how well he had succeeded, so he fastened the machine to his wrist and turned the indicator to the word "up." Slowly he ascended, this time to a height of nearly 20 feet. Then his progress became slower and finally ceased altogether. "That's a little better," he thought. "Now let's see if it will go sideways." He put the indicator to northwest, the direction of home, and very slowly the machine obeyed and carried him away from the plateau and across the island. The natives saw him go, and springing to their feet began uttering excited shouts and throwing their spears at him. But he was already so high and so far away that they failed to reach him, and the boy continued his journey unharmed. Once the branches of a tall tree caught him and nearly tipped him over, but he managed to escape others by drawing up his feet. At last he was free of the island and traveling over the ocean again. He was not at all sorry to bid good-bye to the cannibal island, but he was worried about the machine, which clearly was not in good working order. The vast ocean was beneath him, and he moved no faster than an ordinary walk. "At this rate I'll get home sometime next year," he grumbled. "However, I suppose I ought to be glad the machine works at all." And he really was glad. All the afternoon and all the long summer night he moved slowly over the water. It was annoying to go at a regular jog trot, as Rob called it, after his former swift flight, but there was no help for it. Just as dawn was breaking he saw in the distance a small vessel sailing in the direction he was following, yet scarcely moving for lack of wind. He soon caught up with it, but saw no one on deck, and the craft had a dingy and uncared for appearance that was not reassuring. But after hovering over it for some time, Rob decided to board the ship and rest for a while. He alighted near the bow, where the deck was highest, and was about to explore the place when a man came out of the low cabin and espied him. This person had a most villainous countenance and was dark-skinned, black-bearded, and dressed in an outlandish, piratical costume. On seeing the boy, he gave a loud shout and was immediately joined by 4 companions, each as disagreeable in appearance as the first. Rob knew there would be trouble the moment he looked at this evil crew, and when they drew their daggers and pistols and began fiercely shouting in an unknown tongue, the boy sighed and took the electric tube from his coat pocket. The buccaneers did not notice the movement, but rushed upon him so quickly that he had to press the button at a lively rate. The tube made no noise at all, so it was a strange and remarkable sight to see the pirates suddenly drop to the deck and lie motionless. Indeed, one was so nearly upon him when the electric current struck him that his head, in falling, bumped against Rob's stomach and sent him reeling against the side of the vessel. He quickly recovered himself, and seeing his enemies were rendered harmless, the boy entered the cabin and examined it curiously. It was dirty and ill-smelling enough, but the corners and spare berths were heaped with merchandise of all kinds, which had been taken from those so unlucky as to have met these cruel and desperate men. After a short inspection of the place, he returned to the deck and again seated himself in the bow. The crippled condition of his traveling machine was now his chief trouble, and although a good breeze had sprung up to fill the sails and the little bark was making fair headway, Rob knew he could never expect to reach home unless he could discover a better mode of conveyance than this. He unstrapped the machine from his wrist to examine it better, and while holding it carelessly in his hand, it slipped and fell with a bang to the deck, striking upon its round edge and rolling quickly past the cabin and out of sight. With a cry of alarm he ran after it, and after much search found it lying against the bulwark near the edge of a scupper hole, where the least jar of the ship would have sent it to the bottom of the ocean. Rob hastily seized his treasure, and upon examining it found the fall had bulged the rim so that the old dents scarcely showed at all. But its original shape was more distorted than ever, and Rob feared he had utterly ruined its delicate mechanism. Should this prove to be true, he might now consider himself a prisoner of this piratical band, the members of which, although temporarily disabled, would soon regain consciousness. He sat in the bow, thinking sadly of his misfortunes, until he noticed that one of the men began to stir. The effect of the electrical shock conveyed by the tube was beginning to wear away, and now the buccaneer sat up, rubbed his head in a bewildered fashion, and looked around him. When he saw Rob, he gave a shout of rage and drew his knife, but one motion of the electric tube made him cringe and slip away to the cabin, where he remained out of danger. And now the other 4 sat up, groaning and muttering in their outlandish speech, but they had no notion of facing Rob's tube a second time, so one by one they joined their leader in the cabin, leaving the boy undisturbed. By this time the ship had begun to pitch and toss in an uncomfortable fashion, and Rob noticed that the breeze had increased to a gale. There being no one to look after the sails, the vessel was in grave danger of capsizing or breaking her masts. The waves were now running high, too, and Rob began to be worried. Presently the captain of the pirates stuck his head out of the cabin door, jabbered some unintelligible words, and pointed to the sails. The boy nodded, for he understood they wanted to attend to the rigging. So the crew trooped forth rather fearfully and began to reef the sails and put the ship into condition to weather the storm. Rob paid no further attention to them. He looked at his traveling machine rather doubtfully and wondered if he dared risk its power to carry him through the air. Whether he remained in the ship or trusted to the machine, he stood a good chance of dropping into the sea at any moment. So while he hesitated, he attached the machine to his wrist, and leaned over the bulwarks to watch the progress of the storm. He might stay in the ship until it foundered, he thought, and then take his chances with the machine. He decided to wait until a climax arrived. The climax came the next moment, for while he leaned over the bulwarks the buccaneers stole up behind him and suddenly seized him in their grasp. While two of them held his arms, the others searched his pockets, taking from him the electric tube and the silver box containing his tablets. These they carried to the cabin and threw upon the heap of other valuables they had stolen. They did not notice the traveling machine, however, but seeing him now unarmed, they began jeering and laughing at him, while the brutal captain relieved his anger by giving the prisoner several malicious kicks. Rob bore his misfortune meekly, although he was almost ready to cry with grief and disappointment. But when one of the pirates, to inflict further punishment on the boy, came towards him with a heavy strap, he resolved not to await the blow. Turning the indicator to the word "up," he found to his joy and relief that it would yet obey the influence of the power of repulsion. Seeing him rise into the air, the fellow made a grab for his foot and held it firmly, while his companions ran to help him. Weight seemed to make no difference in the machine. It lifted the pirate as well as Rob. It lifted another who clung to the first man's leg, and another who clung to him. The other two also caught hold, hoping their united strength would pull him down, and the next minute Rob was soaring through the air with the entire string of 5 buccaneers dangling from his left leg. At first the villains were too astounded to speak, but as they realized they were being carried through the air and away from their ship, they broke into loud shouts of dismay, and finally the one who grasped Rob's leg lost his hold and the 5 plunged downward and splashed into the sea. Finding the machine disposed to work accurately, Rob left the buccaneers to swim to the ship in the best way they could, while he dropped down to the deck again and recovered from the cabin his box of tablets and the electric tube. The fellows were just scrambling on board when he again escaped, shooting into the air with considerable speed. Indeed, the instrument now worked better than at any time since he had reached the cannibal island, and the boy was greatly delighted. The wind at first sent him spinning away to the south, but he continued to rise until he was above the air currents, and the storm raged far beneath him. Then he set the indicator to the northwest and breathlessly waited to see if it would obey. Hooray! Away he sped at a fair rate of speed, while all his anxiety changed to a feeling of sweet contentment. His success had greatly surprised him, but he concluded that the jar caused by dropping the instrument had relieved the pressure upon the works, and so helped rather than harmed the free action of the electric currents. While he moved through the air with an easy gliding motion, he watched with much interest the storm raging below. Above his head the sun was peacefully shining, and the contrast was strange and impressive. After an hour or so the storm abated, or else he passed away from it, for the deep blue of the ocean again greeted his eyes. He dropped downward until he was about 100 feet above the water, when he continued his northwesterly course. But now he regretted having interfered for a moment with the action of the machine, for his progress, instead of being swift as a bird's flight, became slow and jerky, nor was he sure that the damaged machine might not break down altogether at any moment. Yet so far his progress was in the right direction, and he resolved to experiment no further with the instrument, but to let it go as it would, so long as it supported him above the water. However irregular the motion might be, it was sure, if continued, to bring him to land in time, and that was all he cared about just then. When night fell his slumber was broken and uneasy, for he wakened more than once with a start of fear that the machine had broken and he was falling into the sea. Sometimes he was carried along at a swift pace, and again the machine scarcely worked at all, so his anxiety was excusable. The following day was one of continued uneasiness for the boy, who began to be harassed by doubts as to whether, after all, he was moving in the right direction. The machine had failed at one time in this respect, and it might again. He had lost all confidence in its accuracy. In spite of these perplexities, Rob passed the second night of his uneven flight in profound slumber, being exhausted by the strain and excitement he had undergone. When he awoke at daybreak, he saw, to his profound delight, that he was approaching land. The rising sun found him passing over a big city, which he knew to be Boston. He did not stop. The machine was so little to be depended upon that he dared make no halt. But he was obliged to alter the direction from northwest to west, and the result of this slight change was so great a reduction in speed that it was midday before he saw beneath him the familiar village in which he lived. Carefully marking the location of his father's house, he came to a stop directly over it, and a few moments later he managed to land upon the exact spot in the back yard whence he had taken his first successful flight. End of chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 7. The Demon Becomes Angry. When Rob had been hugged and kissed by his mother and sisters, and even Mr. Jocelyn had embraced him warmly, he gave them a brief account of his adventures. The story was received with many doubtful looks and much grave shaking of heads, as was quite natural under the circumstances. "I hope, my dear son," said his father, "that you have now passed through enough dangers to last you a lifetime, so that hereafter you will be contented to remain at home." "Oh, Robert," cried his mother, with tears in her loving eyes, "you don't know how we've all worried about you for the past week." "A week?" asked Rob with surprise. "Yes, it's a week tomorrow morning since you flew into the air and disappeared." "Then," said the boy thoughtfully, "I've reached home just in time." "In time for what?" she asked. But he did not answer that question. He was thinking of the Demon, and that on the afternoon of this very day he might expect the wise and splendid genius to visit him a second time. At luncheon, although he did not feel hungry, he joined the family at table and pleased his mother by eating as heartily as of old. He was surprised to find how good the food tasted, and to realize what a pleasure it is to gratify one's sense of taste. The tablets were all right for a journey, he thought, but if he always ate them he would be sure to miss a great deal of enjoyment, since there was no taste to them at all. At 4 o'clock he went to his workshop and unlocked the door. Everything was exactly as he had left it, and he looked at his simple electrical devices with some amusement. They seemed tame beside the wonders now in his possession, yet he recollected that his numerous wires had enabled him to strike the Master Key, and therefore should not be despised. Before long he noticed a quickening in the air, as if it were suddenly surcharged with electric fluid, and the next instant, in a dazzling flash of light, appeared the Demon. "I am here," he announced. "So am I," answered Rob. "But at one time I really thought I should never see you again. I've been—" "Spare me your history," said the Demon coldly. "I am aware of your adventures." "Oh, you are?" said Rob, amazed. "Then you know—" "I know all about your foolish experiences," interrupted the Demon, "for I have been with you constantly, although I remained invisible." "Then you know what a jolly time I've had," returned the boy. "But why do you call them foolish experiences?" "Because they were abominably foolish," retorted the Demon, bitterly. "I entrusted to you gifts of rare scientific interest, electrical devices of such utility that their general adoption by mankind would create a new era in earth life. I hoped your use of these devices would convey such hints to electrical engineers that they would quickly comprehend their mechanism and be able to reproduce them in sufficient quantities to supply the world. And how do you treat these marvelous gifts? Why, you carry them to a cannibal island, where even your crude civilization has not yet penetrated." "I wanted to astonish the natives," said Rob, grinning. The Demon uttered an exclamation of anger and stamped his foot so fiercely that thousands of electric sparks filled the air, to disappear quickly with a hissing, crinkling sound. "You might have astonished those ignorant natives as easily by showing them an ordinary electric light," he cried, mockingly. "The power of your gifts would have startled the most advanced electricians of the world. Why did you waste them upon barbarians?" "Really," faltered Rob, who was frightened and awed by the Demon's vehement anger, "I never intended to visit a cannibal island. I meant to go to Cuba." "Cuba? Is that a center of advanced scientific thought? Why did you not take your marvels to New York or Chicago, or, if you wished to cross the ocean, to Paris or Vienna?" "I never thought of those places," acknowledged Rob, meekly. "Then you were foolish, as I said," declared the Demon, in a calmer tone. "Can you not realize that it is better to be considered great by the intelligent thinkers of the earth than to be taken for a god by stupid cannibals?" "Oh, yes, of course," said Rob. "I wish now that I had gone to Europe. But you're not the only one who has a kick coming," he continued. "Your flimsy traveling machine was nearly the death of me." "Ah, it is true," acknowledged the Demon, frankly. "The case was made of too light material. When the rim was bent, it pressed against the works and impeded the proper action of the currents. Had you gone to a civilized country, such an accident could not have happened. But to avoid possible trouble in the future, I have prepared a new instrument, having a stronger case, which I will exchange for the one you now have." "That's very kind of you," said Rob, eagerly handing his battered machine to the Demon and receiving the new one in return. "Are you sure this will work?" "It is impossible for you to injure it," answered the other. "And how about the next three gifts?" inquired the boy, anxiously. "Before I grant them," replied the Demon, "you must give me a promise to keep away from uncivilized places and to exhibit your acquirements only among people of intelligence." "All right," agreed the boy. "I'm not anxious to visit that island again, or any other uncivilized country." "Then I will add to your possessions three gifts, each more precious and important than the three you have already received." At this announcement Rob began to quiver with excitement and sat staring eagerly at the Demon, while the latter increased in stature and sparkled and glowed more brilliantly than ever. End of chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 8. Rob Acquires New Powers. "I have seen the folly of sending you into the world with an offensive instrument, yet with no method of defense," resumed the Demon presently. "You have knocked over a good many people with that tube during the past week." "I know," said Rob, "but I couldn't help it. It was the only way I had to protect myself." "Therefore my next gift shall be this Garment of Protection. You must wear it underneath your clothing. It has power to accumulate and exercise electric repellent force. Perhaps you do not know what that means, so I will explain more fully. When any missile, such as a bullet, sword, or lance, approaches your person, its rush through the air will arouse the repellent force of which I speak, and this force, being more powerful than the projective force, will arrest the flight of the missile and throw it back again. Therefore, nothing can touch your person that comes with any degree of force or swiftness, and you will be safe from all ordinary weapons. When wearing this garment, you will find it unnecessary to use the electric tube except on rare occasions. Never allow revenge or animosity to influence your conduct. Men may threaten, but they cannot injure you. So you must remember that they do not possess your mighty advantages, and that, because of your strength, you should bear with them patiently." Rob examined the garment with much curiosity. It glittered like silver, yet was soft and pliable as lamb's wool. Evidently the Demon had prepared it especially for his use, for it was just Rob's size. "Now," continued the Demon, more gravely, "we approach the subject of an electrical device so truly marvelous that even I am awed when I contemplate the accuracy and perfection of the natural laws which guide it and permit it to exercise its functions. Mankind has as yet conceived nothing like it, for it requires full knowledge of electrical power to understand even its possibilities." The being paused and drew from an inner pocket something resembling a flat metal box. In size it was about 4 inches by 6 and nearly an inch in thickness. "What is it?" asked Rob wonderingly. "It is an automatic record of events," answered the Demon. "I don't understand," said Rob with hesitation. "I will explain to you its use," returned the Demon. "Although the electrical forces which operate it and the vibratory currents which are the true records must remain unknown to you until your brain has mastered the higher knowledge of electricity. At present the practical side of this invention will be more interesting to you than a review of its scientific construction. Suppose you wish to know the principal events that are occurring in Germany at this present moment. You first turn this little wheel at the side until the word Germany appears in the slot at the small end. Then open the top cover, which is hinged, and those passing events in which you are interested will appear before your eyes." The Demon, as he spoke, opened the cover, and looking within, the boy saw, as in a mirror, a moving picture before him. A regiment of soldiers was marching through the streets of Berlin, and at its head rode a body of horsemen, in the midst of which was the Emperor himself. The people who thronged the sidewalks cheered and waved their hats and handkerchiefs with enthusiasm, while a band of musicians played a German air which Rob could distinctly hear. While he gazed spellbound, the scene changed, and he looked upon a great warship entering a harbor with flying pennants. The rails were lined with officers and men straining their eyes for the first sight of their beloved Vaterland after a long foreign cruise, and a ringing cheer, as from 1,000 throats, came faintly to Rob's ear. Again the scene changed, and within a dingy underground room, hemmed in by walls of stone and dimly lighted by a flickering lamp, a body of wild-eyed, desperate men were plighting an oath to murder the Emperor and overthrow his government. "Anarchists?" asked Rob, trembling with excitement. "Anarchists," answered the Demon, with a faint sneer, and he shut the cover of the record with a sudden snap. "It's wonderful!" cried the boy, with a sigh that was followed by a slight shiver. "The record is, indeed, proof within itself of the marvelous possibilities of electricity. Men are now obliged to depend upon newspapers for information, but these can only relate events long after they have occurred, and newspaper statements are often unreliable and sometimes wholly false, while many events of real importance are never printed in their columns. You may guess what an improvement is this automatic record of events, which is as reliable as truth itself. Nothing can be altered or falsified, for the vibratory currents convey the actual events to your vision even as they happen." "But suppose," said Rob, "that something important should happen while I'm asleep, or not looking at the box." "I have called this a record," replied the Demon, "and such it really is, although I have shown you only such events as are in process of being recorded. By pressing this spring you may open the opposite cover of the box, where all events of importance that have occurred throughout the world during the previous 24 hours will appear before you in succession. You may thus study them at your leisure. The various scenes constitute a register of the world's history, and may be recalled to view as often as you desire." It's like knowing everything," murmured Rob, deeply impressed for perhaps the first time in his life. "It is knowing everything," returned the Demon, "and this mighty gift I have decided to entrust to your care. Be very careful as to whom you permit to gaze upon these pictures of passing events, for knowledge may often cause great misery to the human race."
"I'll be careful," promised the boy, as he took the box reverently within his own hands. "The third and last gift of the present series," resumed the Demon, "is one no less curious than the Record of Events, although it has an entirely different value. It is a character marker." "What's that?" inquired Rob. "I will explain. Perhaps you know that your fellow creatures are more or less hypocritical. That is, they try to appear good when they are not, and wise when in reality they are foolish. They tell you they are friendly when they positively hate you, and try to make you believe they are kind when their natures are cruel. This hypocrisy seems to be a human failing. One of your writers has said with truth that among civilized people things are seldom what they seem." "I've heard that," remarked Rob. "On the other hand," continued the Demon, "some people with fierce countenances are kindly by nature, and many who appear to be evil are in reality honorable and trustworthy. Therefore, that you may judge all your fellow creatures truly and know upon whom to depend, I give you the character marker. It consists of this pair of spectacles. While you wear them, everyone you meet will be marked upon the forehead with a letter indicating his or her character. The good will bear the letter G, the evil the letter E. The wise will be marked with a W, and the foolish with an F. The kind will show a K upon their foreheads, and the cruel a letter C. Thus you may determine by a single look the true natures of all those you encounter." "And are these also electrical in their construction?" asked the boy, as he took the spectacles. "Certainly. Goodness, wisdom, and kindness are natural forces, creating character. For this reason men are not always to blame for bad character, as they acquire it unconsciously. All character sends out certain electrical vibrations, which these spectacles concentrate in their lenses and exhibit to the gaze of their wearer, as I have explained." "It's a fine idea," said the boy. "Who discovered it?" "It is a fact that has always existed, but now it is utilized for the first time." "Oh," said Rob. "With these gifts, and the ones you acquired a week ago, you are now equipped to astound the world and awaken mankind to a realization of the wonders that may be accomplished by natural forces. See that you employ these powers wisely in the interests of science, and do not forget your promise to exhibit your electrical marvels only to those who are the most capable of comprehending them." "I'll remember," said Rob. "Then adieu, until a week from today, when I will meet you here at this hour and bestow upon you the last 3 gifts which you are entitled to receive. Goodbye." "Goodbye," repeated Rob, and in a gorgeous flash of color the Demon disappeared, leaving the boy alone in the room with his new and wonderful possessions. End of chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 9. The Second Journey. By this time you will have gained a fair idea of Rob's character. He is, in truth, a typical American boy, possessing an average intelligence not yet regulated by the balance wheel of experience. The mysteries of electricity were so attractive to his eager nature that he had devoted considerable time and some study to electrical experiment. But his study was the superficial kind that seeks to master only such details as may be required at the moment. Moreover, he was full of boyish recklessness and irresponsibility, and therefore difficult to impress with the dignity of science and the gravity of human existence. Life to him was a great theater wherein he saw himself the most interesting, if not the most important actor, and so enjoyed the play with unbounded enthusiasm. Aside from the extraordinary accident which had forced the electrical demon into his life, Rob may be considered one of those youngsters who might possibly develop into a brilliant manhood or enter upon an ordinary humdrum existence as fate should determine. Just at present he had no thought beyond the passing hour, nor would he bother himself by attempting to look ahead or plan for the future. Yet the importance of his electrical possessions and the stern injunction of the Demon to use them wisely had rendered the boy more thoughtful than at any previous time during his brief life, and he became so preoccupied at the dinner table that his father and mother cast many anxious looks in his direction. Of course Rob was anxious to test his newly acquired powers, and decided to lose no time in starting upon another journey; but he said nothing to any of the family about it, fearing to meet with opposition. He passed the evening in the sitting room in company with his father and mother and sisters, and even controlled his impatience to the extent of playing a game of carom with Nell; but he grew so nervous and impatient at last that his sister gave up the game in disgust and left him to his own amusement. At one time he thought of putting on the electric spectacles and seeing what the real character of each member of his family might be, but a sudden fear took possession of him that he might regret the act forever afterward. They were his nearest and dearest friends on earth, and in his boyish heart he loved them all and believed in their goodness and sincerity. The possibility of finding a bad character mark on any of their familiar faces made him shudder, and he determined then and there never to use the spectacles to view the face of a friend or relative. Had any one at that moment been gazing at Rob through the lenses of the wonderful character marker, I am sure a big W would have been found upon the boy's forehead. When the family circle broke up and all retired for the night, Rob kissed his parents and sisters with real affection before going to his own room. But on reaching his cozy little chamber, instead of preparing for bed, Rob clothed himself in the Garment of Repulsion. Then he covered the glittering garment with his best summer suit of clothes, which effectively concealed it. He now looked around to see what else he should take, and thought of an umbrella, a raincoat, a book or two to read during the journey, and several things besides, but he ended by leaving them all behind. "I can't be loaded down with so much truck," he decided, "and I'm going into civilized countries this time, where I can get anything I need." However, to prevent a recurrence of the mistake he had previously made, he tore a map of the world and a map of Europe from his geography, and folding them up placed them in his pocket. He also took a small compass that had once been a watch charm, and finally the contents of a small iron bank that opened with a combination lock. This represented all his savings, amounting to $2.17 in dimes, nickels, and pennies. "It isn't a fortune," he thought as he counted it up, "but I didn't need any money the last trip, so perhaps I'll get along somehow. I don't like to tackle Dad for more, for he might ask questions and try to keep me at home." By the time he had finished his preparations and stowed all his electrical belongings in his various pockets, it was nearly midnight and the house was quiet. So Rob stole downstairs in his stocking feet and noiselessly opened the back door. It was a beautiful July night, and in addition to the light of the full moon, the sky was filled with the radiance of countless thousands of brilliant stars. After Rob had put on his shoes, he unfolded the map, which was plainly visible by the starlight, and marked the direction he must take to cross the Atlantic and reach London, his first stopping place. Then he consulted his compass, put the indicator of his traveling machine to the word "up," and shot swiftly into the air. When he had reached a sufficient height, he placed the indicator to a point north of east, and with a steady and remarkably swift flight began his journey. "Here goes," he remarked with a sense of exultation, "for another week of adventure. I wonder what'll happen between now and next Saturday." End of chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Master Key by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 10. How Rob Served a Mighty King.
The new traveling machine was a distinct improvement over the old one, for it carried Rob with wonderful speed across the broad Atlantic. He fell asleep soon after starting and only wakened when the sun was high in the heavens. But he found himself whirling along at a good rate, with the greenish shimmer of the peaceful ocean waves spread beneath him far beyond his range of vision. Being in the track of the ocean steamers, it was not long before he found himself overtaking a magnificent vessel whose decks were crowded with passengers. He dropped down some distance to enable him to see these people more plainly, and while he hovered near he could hear the excited exclamations of the passengers, who focused dozens of marine glasses upon his floating form. This inspection somewhat embarrassed him, and having no mind to be stared at, he put on additional speed and soon left the steamer far behind him. About noon the sky clouded over, and Rob feared a rainstorm was approaching, so he rose to a point considerably beyond the clouds, where the air was thin but remarkably pleasant to inhale, and the rays of the sun were not so hot as when reflected by the surface of the water. He could see the dark clouds rolling beneath him like volumes of smoke from a factory chimney, and knew the earth was catching a severe shower of rain, yet he congratulated himself on his foresight in not being burdened with umbrella or raincoat, since his elevated position rendered him secure from rain clouds. But, having cut himself off from the earth, there remained nothing to see except the clear sky overhead and the tumbling clouds beneath, so he took from his pocket the automatic record of events and watched with breathless interest the incidents occurring in different parts of the world. A big battle was being fought in the Philippines, and so fiercely was it contested that Rob watched its progress for hours with rapt attention. Finally, a brave rally by the Americans sent their foes to the cover of the woods, where they scattered in every direction, only to form again in a deep valley hidden by high hills. "If only I was there," thought Rob, "I could show that captain where to find the rebels and capture them. But I guess the Philippines are rather out of my way, so our soldiers will never know how near they are to a complete victory." The boy also found considerable amusement in watching the course of an insurrection in Venezuela, where opposing armies of well-armed men preferred to bluster and threaten rather than come to blows. During the evening he found that an important event was Madame Bernhardt's production of a new play, and Rob followed it from beginning to end with great enjoyment, although he felt a bit guilty at not having purchased a ticket. "But it's a crowded house, anyway," he reflected, "and I'm not taking up a reserved seat or keeping anyone else from seeing the show, so where's the harm? Yet it seems to me if these records get to be common, as the Demon wishes, people will all stay at home and see the shows, and the poor actors will starve to death." The thought made him uneasy, and he began, for the first time, to entertain a doubt of the Demon's wisdom in forcing such devices upon humanity. The clouds had now passed away, and the moon sent her rays to turn the edges of the waves into glistening showers of jewels. Rob closed the lid of the wonderful record of events and soon fell into a deep sleep that held him unconscious for many hours. When he awoke he gave a start of surprise, for beneath him was land. How long it was since he had left the ocean behind him he could not guess, but his first thought was to set the indicator of the traveling machine to 0 and to hover over the country until he could determine where he was. This was no easy matter. He saw green fields, lakes, groves, and villages, but these might exist in any country. Being still at a great elevation, he descended gradually until he was about 20 feet from the surface of the earth, where he paused near the edge of a small village. At once a crowd of excited people assembled, shouting to one another and pointing toward him in wonder. In order to be prepared for emergencies, Rob had taken the electric tube from his pocket, and now, as he examined the dress and features of the people below, the tube suddenly slipped from his grasp and fell to the ground, where one end stuck slantingly into the soft earth. A man rushed eagerly towards it, but the next moment he threw up his hands and fell upon his back unconscious. Others who ran to assist their fallen comrade quickly tumbled into a heap beside him.
It was evident to Rob that the tube had fallen in such a position that the button was being pressed continually and a current of electric fluid issued to shock whoever came near. Not wishing to injure these people, he dropped to the ground and drew the tube from the earth, thus releasing the pressure upon the button. But the villagers had now decided that the boy was their enemy, and no sooner had he touched the ground than a shower of stones and sticks rained about him. Not one reached his body, however, for the Garment of Repulsion stopped their flight and returned them to rattle with more or less force against those who had thrown them, like regular boomerangs, thought Rob. To receive their own blows in this fashion seemed so like magic to the simple folk that with roars of fear and pain they ran away in all directions. "It's no use stopping here," remarked Rob regretfully, "for I've spoiled my welcome by this accident. I think these people are Irish by their looks and speech, so I must be somewhere in the Emerald Isle." He consulted his map and decided upon the general direction he should take to reach England, after which he again rose into the air and before long was passing over the channel towards the shores of England. Either his map or compass or his calculations proved wrong, for it was high noon before, having changed his direction a half-dozen times, he came to the great city of London. He saw at a glance that it would never do to drop into the crowded streets unless he wanted to become an object of public curiosity, so he looked around for a suitable place to alight. Near by was a monstrous church that sent a sharp steeple far into the air. Rob examined this spire and saw a narrow opening in the masonry that led to a small room where a chime of bells hung. He crept through the opening, and finding a ladder that connected the belfry with the platform below, began to descend. There were 3 ladders and then a winding flight of narrow, rickety stairs to be passed before Rob finally reached a small room in the body of the church. This room proved to have 2 doors, one connecting with the auditorium and the other letting into a side street. Both were locked, but Rob pointed the electric tube at the outside door and broke the lock in an instant. Then he walked into the street as composedly as if he had lived all his life in London. There were plenty of sights to see, you may be sure, and Rob walked around until he was so tired that he was glad to rest upon one of the benches in a beautiful park. Here, half hidden by the trees, he amused himself by looking at the record of events. "London's a great town, and no mistake," he said to himself. "But let's see what the British are doing in South Africa today." He turned the cylinder to South Africa, and opening the lid at once became interested. An English column, commanded by a brave but stubborn officer, was surrounded by the Boer forces and fighting desperately to avoid capture or annihilation. "This would be interesting to King Edward," thought the boy. "Guess I'll hunt him up and tell him about it." A few steps away stood a policeman. Rob approached him and asked, "Where's the king today?" The officer looked at him with mingled surprise and suspicion. "'Is Majesty is sojournin' at Marlborough House just now," was the reply. "P'r'aps you wants to make him a wisit," he continued with lofty sarcasm. "That's it exactly," said Rob. "I'm an American, and thought while I was in London I'd drop in on His Royal Highness and say hello to him." The officer chuckled, as if much amused. "Hamericans is bloomin' green," he remarked. "So youse can stand for Hamerican right enough. No other wisitors is such blarsted fools. But yon's the palace, and I s'pose His Majesty'll give you a 'ot reception." "Thanks. I'll look him up," said the boy, and left the officer convulsed with laughter. He soon knew why. The palace was surrounded by a cordon of the king's own life guards, who admitted no one save those who presented proper credentials. "There's only one thing to do," thought Rob, "and that's to walk straight in, as I haven't any friends to give me a regular introduction." So he boldly advanced to the gate, where he found himself stopped by crossed carbines and a cry of "Halt!" "Excuse me," said Rob. "I'm in a hurry." He pushed the carbines aside and marched on. The soldiers made thrusts at him with their weapons, and an officer jabbed at his breast with a glittering sword, but the Garment of Repulsion protected him from these dangers, as well as from a hail of bullets that followed his advancing figure. He reached the entrance of the palace only to face another group of guardsmen and a second order to halt. And as these soldiers were over 6 feet tall and stood shoulder to shoulder, Rob saw that he could not hope to pass them without using his electric tube. "Stand aside, you fellows!" he ordered. There was no response. He extended the tube, and as he pressed the button, described a semicircle with the instrument. Immediately the tall guardsmen toppled over like so many tenpins, and Rob stepped across their bodies and penetrated to the reception room, where a brilliant assemblage awaited, in hushed and anxious groups, for opportunity to obtain audience with the king. "I hope his Majesty isn't busy," said Rob to a solemn-visaged official who confronted him. "I want to have a little talk with him." Beg pardon," exclaimed the astounded Master of Ceremonies. "What name, please?" "Oh, never mind my name," replied Rob, and pushing the gentleman aside he entered the audience chamber of the great king. King Edward was engaged in earnest consultation with one of his ministers, and after a look of surprise in Rob's direction and a grave bow he bestowed no further attention upon the intruder. But Rob was not to be baffled now. "Your Majesty," he interrupted, "I've important news for you. A big fight is taking place in South Africa, and your soldiers will probably be cut into mincemeat." The minister strode towards the boy angrily. "Explain this intrusion!" he cried. "I have explained. The Boers are having a regular killing bee. Here, take a look at it yourselves." He drew the record from his pocket, and at the movement the minister shrank back as if he suspected it was an infernal machine and might blow his head off. But the king stepped quietly to the boy's side and looked into the box when Rob threw open the lid. As he comprehended the full wonder of the phenomenon he was observing, Edward uttered a low cry of amazement, but thereafter he silently gazed upon the fierce battle that still raged far away upon the African veldt. Before long his keen eye recognized the troops engaged and realized their imminent danger. "They'll be utterly annihilated!" he gasped. "What shall we do?" "Oh, we can't do anything just now," answered Rob. "But it's curious to watch how bravely the poor fellows fight for their lives." The minister, who by this time was also peering into the box, groaned aloud, and then all three forgot their surroundings in the tragedy they were beholding. Hemmed in by vastly superior numbers, the English were calmly and stubbornly resisting every inch of advance and selling their lives as dearly as possible. Their leader fell pierced by 100 bullets, and the king, who had known him from boyhood, passed his hand across his eyes as if to shut out the awful sight. But the fascination of the battle forced him to look again, and the next moment he cried aloud, "Look there! Look there!" Over the edge of a line of hills appeared the helmets of a file of English soldiers. They reached the summit, followed by rank after rank, until the hillside was alive with them. And then, with a ringing cheer that came like a faint echo to the ears of the three watchers, they broke into a run and dashed forward to the rescue of their brave comrades. The Boers faltered, gave back, and the next moment fled precipitately, while the exhausted survivors of the courageous band fell sobbing into the arms of their rescuers. Rob closed the lid of the record with a sudden snap that betrayed his deep feeling, and the king pretended to cough behind his handkerchief and stealthily wiped his eyes. "'Twasn't so bad, after all," remarked the boy with assumed cheerfulness, "but it looked mighty ticklish for your men at one time." King Edward regarded the boy curiously, remembering his abrupt entrance and the marvelous device he had exhibited. "What do you call that?" he asked, pointing at the record with a finger that trembled slightly from excitement. "It is a new electrical invention," replied Rob, replacing it in his pocket, "and so constructed that events are reproduced at the exact moment they occur." "Where can I purchase one?" demanded the king eagerly. "They're not for sale," said Rob. "This one of mine is the first that ever happened." "Oh!" "I really think," continued the boy, nodding sagely, "that it wouldn't be well to have these records scattered around. Their use would give some folks unfair advantage over others, you know." "Certainly." "I only showed you this battle because I happened to be in London at the time and thought you'd be interested." "It was very kind of you," said Edward. "But how did you gain admittance?" Well, to tell you the truth, I was obliged to knock over a few of your tall Life Guards. They seem to think that you're a good thing and need looking after, like jam in a cupboard." The king smiled. "I hope you haven't killed my guards," said he. "Oh, no. They'll come around all right." "It is necessary," continued Edward, "that public men be protected from intrusion, no matter how democratic they may be personally. You would probably find it as difficult to approach the President of the United States as the King of England." "Oh, I'm not complaining," said Rob. "It wasn't much trouble to break through." "You seem quite young to have mastered such wonderful secrets of nature," continued the king. "So I am," replied Rob, modestly. "But these natural forces have really existed since the beginning of the world, and someone was sure to discover them in time." He was quoting the Demon, although unconsciously. "You are an American, I suppose?" said the minister, coming close to Rob and staring him in the face. "Guessed right the first time," answered the boy, and drawing his character-marking spectacles from his pocket, he put them on and stared at the minister in turn. Upon the man's forehead appeared the letter E. "Your Majesty," said Rob, "I have here another queer invention. Will you please wear these spectacles for a few moments?" The king at once put them on. "They are called character markers," continued the boy, "because the lenses catch and concentrate the character vibrations radiating from every human individual and reflect the true character of the person upon his forehead. If a letter G appears, you may be sure his disposition is good. If his forehead is marked with an E, his character is evil, and you must beware of treachery." The king saw the E plainly marked upon his minister's forehead, but he said nothing except "Thank you," and returned the spectacles to Rob. But the minister, who from the first had been ill at ease, now became positively angry. "Do not believe him, your Majesty!" he cried. "It is a trick, and meant to deceive you." "I did not accuse you," answered the king, sternly. Then he added, "I wish to be alone with this young gentleman." The minister left the room with an anxious face and hanging head. "Now," said Rob, "let's look over the record of the past day and see if that fellow has been up to any mischief." He turned the cylinder of the record to England, and slowly the events of the last 24 hours were reproduced, one after the other, upon the polished plate. Before long the king uttered an exclamation. The record pictured a small room in which were seated three gentlemen engaged in earnest conversation. One of them was the accused minister. "Those men," said the king in a low voice, while he pointed out the other two, "are my avowed enemies. This is proof that your wonderful spectacles indicated my minister's character with perfect truth. I am grateful to you for thus putting me upon my guard, for I have trusted the man fully." "Oh, don't mention it," replied the boy, lightly. "I'm glad to have been of service to you, but it's time for me to go." "I hope you will favor me with another interview," said the king, "for I am much interested in your electrical inventions. I will instruct my guards to admit you at any time, so you will not be obliged to fight your way in." "All right, but it doesn't really matter," answered Rob. "It's no trouble at all to knock 'em over." Then he remembered his manners and bowed low before the king, who seemed to him a fine fellow and not a bit stuck up. And then he walked calmly from the palace. The people in the outer room stared at him wonderingly, and the officer of the guard saluted the boy respectfully. But Rob only smiled in an amused way as he marched past them with his hands thrust deep into his trousers pockets and his straw hat tipped jauntily upon the back of his head. End of chapter 10.